And thank you everyone for joining me tonight. I have lots to go through today. If you see me talk, I usually go fast. So definitely write down your questions and we'll try to address them at the end. I actually have a colleague who's with me today, Sally Lee. She's also a registered psychologist who'll be helping me answer questions at the end. There's a lot to take in and I'm going to try to break things down as much as I can. I'm going to go through some of the most common learning differences that we see. And if I have time, I've got bonus material at the end. So I added that extra. There's 50-50 if we're actually going to get to it, but I wrote it all out, so it's pretty straightforward. It's just talking about independence with school, but they're in the handout so that you can get them tomorrow if I don't make it through it today. So the first piece is knowing whether our kiddo is actually struggling in school. Is there a learning difference? Are they really going to need having an assessment done or having special educational services or strategies, those types of things? If your child does have, essentially this is known as a learning disability. If it's a learning disability, it's a chronic problem with learning. It's not just, difficulties learning this unit or this sort of subject. So learning disability, it's a neurological condition. That's meaning it results from differences in the way the brain sends information, receives information, processes that information. There's differences in the brain. It has nothing to do with being lazy. And I often see parents like, he's just lazy, when it's this thing that he loves, video games, he's great. But as soon as it comes to writing, there's just no motivation. It's actually real things that are happening in the brain that makes it hard for them to learn or to show what they know. And even if a kiddo learns to compensate, and I do see that a lot, where they're learning strategies to sort of overcome those learning challenges, those differences in the brain usually are lifelong. And so we see differences. That's not to say that they can't overcome things and learn things. We have great hope for them being successful. Lots of people with even severe dyslexia are very successful in life. It's just knowing that they might need to do things a little bit different. So when we look at what is a learning disability, it's a range severity, and it really tends to make it hard for kiddos to learn a skill using typical teaching methods that we find in most of our classrooms, or using that skill effectively in different areas. So the most common ones that we see, of course, are anything around oral language, reading, writing, and math. But there's some other things that you might not think about that are also learning disabilities. Social skills, that's considered a learning disability as well. So we might have social perception, being able to perceive what's going on, understanding other people's intentions. Social interaction, knowing how to effectively navigate different social situations. Perspective taking, can I understand what's going on for my friend over here who wants to play Uno, but I want to play something else, for example, but just taking other people's perspective. Also, organizational abilities, that's another area where we could see learning disabilities. So what we end up seeing is this unexpected underachievement in one of these areas, or kids might be okay in their achievement, but it takes so much effort, so much time, so much support to get there. So we look at students with learning disabilities, they might have difficulties with their academic achievement, but also the progression that they're making. So they might, there's just a gap in that learning. So they might be still progressing a little bit, but just not to the same extent where we would expect them to compared to other kiddos. And so there's this discrepancy between their potential for learning and what they're actually learning. So there is that gap. And we often see, and this is actually true for a lot of kids, but we see this uneven pattern of development. So maybe they've got really great athleticism, right? Or they've got an amazing language, vocabulary, but they just can't do their writing. So we look at learning differences. It can have an effect on input. So that's the brain's ability to take in the information in the first place, or it could be output. So I've learned it, I just can't show you that I've learned it very well. And so then that's affecting their reading or their math or their spelling. And I see this all the time where kids know their letter sounds and they can map their letter sounds, but then they just can't actually read words in a passage, for example. So it's really important, before we go any further, to know even if there is a child with a severe learning disability, they're smart. It has nothing to do with their intelligence. Oftentimes, they're very smart. They're very talented. They're very resourceful. They just learn differently. And the brain is processing information information differently. So we should be talking about learning differences versus a disability. And that's why I keep talking about differences. But for schools and for coding and for supports, we still talk about a learning disability. But I think that's really important for us to get our head wrapped around. It's a difference. And we need to figure out what that difference is so that we can support them, because they can be successful. There's lots of kiddos who can be successful academically. We just need to make sure we have the right supports in place to make learning an equal playing ground for them. Right? Just like I wear glasses to help me see just as well as other students to see that board, we need to give them their strategies so that they can learn just as effectively as other kiddos. So again, remembering it has nothing to do with how smart they are. It has nothing to do with poor instruction or laziness, lack of motivation, or even seeing or hearing. Those can certainly contribute, but a learning difference specifically is stuff that's happening in the brain. The other thing we need to think about is learning differences. They're not isolated. It's not specifically just this little area of reading. Oftentimes, if there's reading, we see writing as well, but there's also a lot of overlap in math. Lots of kiddos have more than just one area of difficulty in their learning or differences in their learning. And so you got to know it doesn't just affect their academics. It could also affect, yes, reading, writing, math, but it could also affect their sports, their family interactions, their friendships. Especially if they're feeling frustrated in class, they're more likely to have behavioral problems or maybe be snippy with you or snippy with friends, or they internalize. While lots of kids might have good language skills, they might have trouble with motor skills, and that could affect, I see lots of kiddos who can't go out and play basketball or can't play foursquare, and so then they're having problems interacting socially as well. And that makes it really hard to see the whole picture and understand the cause and effect relationships. Like if I do this, that could really hurt your feelings. So it could be these other areas. It's like, you're so smart, why can't you get the situation? So there's so many different things that could be happening here. I am specifically focusing on the learning differences in terms of reading, writing, math today. But I think I just wanted to give you that other information so you can start being aware, if your kiddo is struggling socially, because I've got one of those kiddos, ADHD, struggling socially, struggling with writing. Although we're moving with this neurodiverse language of learning differences, we still, like I said, often hear about these specific learning disabilities. That's really important to identify for special education services. And so it's describing specific areas of learning differences, essentially. So the most common, of course, are these three. So we've got impairments in reading, in writing, and in math. And I'm going to go into particular areas of dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, because we want to get as specific as possible. I see all the time reports are coming across my desk where this kiddo's got reading disability, right? And I'm like, well, okay, so reading and what about reading is hard for them? So just saying a learning disability in reading is not enough. There's 4 different areas that could be affected. Saying dyslexia isn't enough. I'm like, okay, what kind of dyslexia? We need to know the primary challenges. And that's why I wanted to do this presentation so we can get specific. Because I know if you've had an assessment done or you're wondering about it, sometimes it can be so overwhelming because it's like, where do I go from here? And if we aren't specific, it's kind of like, Russian roulette. We're just kind of hitting and missing, just trying to figure out what's going on. So when we look at it, is it decoding and auditory discrimination, for example? So these are different things that you have to know exactly what's going on for your child. If you're just a parent, I'm going to be saying big words. I'm going to break it down, though, for you, but it's just understanding there's a lot going on. We have to know whether or not there is a learning disability, and if there are, it's not just about exploring reading. What other effects does it have on that child? Because there's huge implications on their social, emotional development, their self-esteem, their self-advocacy, because a lot of learning disabilities are missed and they can go unrecognized for years, especially if you've got a bright kiddo. They might be able to mask their difficulties. And I've seen some kids in high school and even university who never knew they had a learning disability, but they struggled so much. They didn't have a social life because they were doing their homework all night long. And then it turned into anxiety and depression because of their struggles. So without understanding a kiddo's learning profile, and even if, I love assessments for all kids, just so we can understand what their learning profile is. But if there are those areas of difficulty, we want to get very specific as to what those differences are, because there can be really grave consequences. If you've got a kiddo who can't read, that really affects how they see themselves, especially as a learner. And if they don't feel that they're smart, if they don't feel like they're a good learner, it doesn't matter what strategies or supports we put into place. It doesn't matter how motivated they are, right? A huge majority of our kiddos, research has shown over 70% of them who are below average readers by first grade, they're going to continue to struggle in 8th grade. So we want early intervention so that we can circumvent any of these sort of social emotional difficulties that are going on, because when those learning differences are addressed, we don't want to wait. Oftentimes we'll hear, wait till grade 2, wait till grade 3. But if they've got problems in grade 1, they probably have problems in grade 8, unless we can address them appropriately in grade 1 or even earlier. That would be great. Because it does become an impairing deficit that worsen as they progress in school. And that's where, it starts to become a problem that can contribute to self-esteem and depression and anxiety and feelings of shame and inadequacy, all of these things. And we don't want our kiddos to get there. And then, of course, kids don't want to learn, and they don't want to practice, and they don't want tutors. And that's only going to perpetuate their difficulties, because they're not getting those opportunities to learn. They're starting to avoid them, and we don't want that. So we want to catch good kids while they still want to do good, because their motivation is going to be in. Otherwise, they're just going to be like, I'm done. I'm done in high school. They're probably not going to pursue higher education. They're at increased risk for all sorts of other things. So we want to keep them in the game, that they feel like, I can learn. This is tricky. I don't know it yet, but I want to learn. So I'm just going to go over some general signs. If you're wondering, there's no one single sign to say, aha, you've got a learning difference. We need to get on this. There's so many, and I won't even be able to cover them all, but I do want to share a few of those certain clues that we see. Not all kiddos, again, remember, they don't show all of these, but if you notice your kiddo showing a few of them, maybe you want to get a screener done, or consider getting an assessment done. I will be getting into specific signs to watch for specific learning differences, but general signs, these are kind of a list about, if there was any developmental delays early on, chronic ear infections even could affect reading, or articulation difficulties could affect reading. If there's any language, or they're forgetting things, you just learned this yesterday, why can't you remember it today? They're not wanting to go to school. You see that self-esteem. They have difficulties with attention. They're getting frustrated with homework. All of these kinds of signs are clues that something else might be going on. Trouble following directions, just sequencing those sort of if-then, eye-hand coordinations, doing up their zipper, tying their shoelaces. Sorry, there must be a squirrel. My dogs are barking. Having trouble with change. They're rigid. I have to know what's coming up, so there's a lot of rigidities that way. There's so many different things that could be contributing to it. So we just want to be on the watch out for these signs. Now, we see a lot of behavioral pieces. Oftentimes there's two types of behaviors. We've got our internalizers. They tend to be quiet. They might be withdrawn. They might be embarrassed about receiving any attention. So they want to try to make themselves as small as possible in the classroom. They worry that other kids will see their academic weaknesses, so they don't want to read out loud. There's a lot of stress over that. So we might see boredom. We might see carelessnesses. I can't say carelessness. Attention difficulties, they're just slow to respond. Oftentimes our internalizers, they're causing themselves more distress. And they often get overlooked because they're well behaved. They're sitting quietly, right? They're trying to make themselves small. Externalizers, they cause everybody else distressed because their behaviors are coming out. They're usually caught a little bit easier. So I'm actually worried about my internalizers because they slip through the cracks. The externalizers, the only problem with externalizers is they're the ones who are more likely to be like, oh, this teacher, or the teacher will say, this kiddo is pretty defiant. He's pretty oppositional, right? Or he's a class clown because he's joking around. Not realizing that class clownishness is because I don't want other kids to see that I can't read. And so I would rather be disruptive in class than to be known as dumb, right? And oftentimes they're embarrassed, they're feeling a lot of those same feelings, but they're breaking rules. They're trying to, take the attention off of their learning difficulties, but we see a lot more behaviors and aggression. So, unfortunately, we see those kinds of behaviors as well. I even break it down as well in terms of where they are in school. So this will all be in your handouts. The signs can really vary during different stages of their childhood. So we can look at these, a little bit more specifically. Again, I can't go through all of them. We just don't have time, but I wanted to give you as much of this list as I can so that you can start looking out for some of these signs. I do want to get into the signs. Like I said, I want to dig deep into reading, writing, and math. Kids with reading differences, often they have trouble perceiving spoken word as a combination of distinct sounds: rain, coat, toothpaste, cup, cake. So that can make it really hard to understand how those letters represent a sound and how those letter combinations make a word as well. And I was just doing the major sounds, but even being able to break down, hearing the r, a, n, they can't hear those distinct sounds. Oftentimes, kiddos can hear those distinct sounds, figure out those distinct sounds, but they've got a problem with working memory. They can't hold and manipulate that information. That can play a role as well. That's why we need to figure out what it is. It's not, because some kids can break things down, and I'll see it where kids will go at, but by the time they get to the t, they've forgotten the k, and then they're like, hat, right? They'll just say something completely different, even though they got all of their letters right. Now they're saying something completely different. So even with those basic reading skills, if they're mastered, we might see kids having trouble reading fluency, being able to understand what they read, remember what they read, spelling, making inferences. So there's lots of different things, even if they've mastered. And this is what I start seeing for older kids. They've found a way to sort of mask their difficulties. They found strategies to figure things out. They're really good at maybe using chapter headings or words, picking out words that they do know to make it look like they understand, but they're really struggling. Now, when we look at differences in reading, oftentimes we think of dyslexia. It's the most common learning disability that we've got out there. Those without these reading difficulties, they can automatically process a word. So for example, I remember my daughter, when she was in about grade 3, she came across the word arachnophobia. She had never seen arachnophobia before, pretty tricky word, but she looked at it and she was able to, she did pause, but only for about 2 seconds, and she was automatically able to process the word that she's never seen before based on the strategies and keys that she's unlocked the code of reading is essentially what it is. She knows how to unlock that code. And she was able to say it, arachnophobia, right away. And I'm like, how did you do that? Because I'm so used to working with kiddos who can't do that. But if a kiddo hasn't learned that secret code of how to read, then reading is slow. It tends to be really effortful. And it's really important to know that there's different types of dyslexia. If you're just saying your kiddo's got dyslexia, you have to really know what does that actually mean, because there's different types. So the first type is dysphonetic dyslexia. For these kiddos, their brain has trouble processing the sounds. So sorting out, analyzing, sequencing those sounds that we hear in language. And it's really, it's language-based because they can't process those sounds that they hear in words. So what we would see is they're just having trouble with decoding. They're reading fluency, it's really choppy. They're having trouble spelling. Surface dyslexia, there's lots of different names for this, visual form dyslexia, but essentially they can't remember what words look like in their head. So the process of reading never becomes automatic because English is all about irregular words. We can't sound out a lot of the words. So you just automatically have to know what that word looks like arachnophobia, for example. These kids, they do understand the sounds in words, so they over-rely on sounding out words. They're always, every word that they're coming across, they're sounding out all the letters. Because that reading, it just never becomes automatic because it's sound by sound. they're not seeing it word by word. And so that's really time consuming. And, you know, they're going to make lots of mistakes and it just takes them longer to learn those words. Then we've got mixed dyslexia. That's both the phonological difficulties and the visual spatial difficulties. So they have trouble. They don't have, like I was talking about, that usable key to be able to unlock reading and spelling. They don't really have that. So we see bizarre error patterns where the words, when they're spelling or sounding it out, it doesn't sound or look like anything that's actually written on the page. And so that's usually when they've got both, because they can't sound it out and they can't figure out what it looks like in their head. And then we've got deep dyslexia as well. It's very, very rare. You know, I rarely see this deep dyslexia, but that's just reading comprehension. So they can decode no problem, they can read fluently, but they have no idea what it is they're reading. They can't take meaning out of what they're reading. So they can read things like chair or table or book because they've got both a picture in their head and a word for those things. So for those words, they can easily come up with that, oh, book, I know exactly what that looks like in my head. But they can make errors based on semantics. So maybe the word is dinner, and so in their head, they can see dinner, but they don't really see it as dinner, they see it as food. So you might have the word dinner and they're reading food. It can be very bizarre, right? Or there's visual miscues. The visual miscues, for example, is if I see the word crown, but I'm actually reading it as crowd. So that's a visual sort of miscue. So there's lots of different kinds that could end up happening, which is really tricky. Less known, but that's important. So that's the reading piece, and I will be getting into recommendations as well, but I just want to kind of go through some of these. With writing requires a lot of complex processes. We have to visually see words, we have the motor input to be able to spell our words, we have to process information. There's so many things going on. So when we look at difficulties with writing, we might just see really slow, effortful work. The handwriting, it's just painful to watch them to write. Maybe it's really hard to read what they're writing. Maybe they're having trouble, like they can talk about their ideas beautifully, but they just can't get it down onto paper. And I hear this a lot of my high school students. They're like, I've got this beautiful story in my head, but when I write it, it's nothing like what I had in my head. Maybe it's disorganized, it's hard to understand. I have kids who forget what they've already written. So they might have once upon a time, there, right? They've forgotten what they've already written. Trouble with spelling, grammar, punctuation, all of those kinds of things. So this is also known as dysgraphia, which is really about how easily kiddos can learn written language and how well they can express their thoughts through writing. Now, most students can express themselves beautifully verbally, but they can't get those ideas down onto the page. But because their verbal skills are so strong, we often expect that they should be able to write just as well too. And then I find it's usually with the writing that I hear a lot of parents saying he's just so lazy to get his homework done. But we forget it's so effortful for them. And they tend to want to avoid writing. And then that creates a lot of stress and anxiety. And that's a whole other issue. When our amygdala is triggered, we're on fight and flight sort of response actions here. So it can cause a lot of stress for everybody. So when we look at the graph part of the word dysgraphia, that refers both to the hand's function in writing and to the letters formed by hand. So it affects handwriting, and that can interfere with our spelling, our ability to spell. So that's one piece. We also have this thing called orthographic coding in working memory, and that's also related to handwriting. So again, they can't picture what a word looks like in your head. So if you can see, if I asked you to spell the word school, you could see the word school in your head to be able to write it down. They don't have that. And so it's really hard. They don't have that permanent sort of memory of what written words are. And so it's really tricky. And I see lots of kids, they're not using, even just the other day, I had a kiddo and he wanted to write a story about an elephant. And he's like, well, how do you spell elephant? I'm like, do your best, kiddo. I can't help you. And so he just used cat. He didn't want to use elephant anymore because he didn't know how to spell it. And it's just so effortful. So he just chose cat. And I see that where kids have beautiful vocabulary, but their writing is so simplistic because they don't know how to spell or write those words. Some kids, we do see mistakes with the letter reversals, or maybe they're sequencing letters incorrectly in a word. And you know, if they remembered what words look like, you know, the I before E or R before E or those types of things, or they know, like in school, for example, they know that there's an H in there, but they have no idea where the H goes. It's because they can't remember what it looks like in their head. And oftentimes they just can't write things quickly enough. And so then we see some of those reversals. So it's not just about handwriting. Dysgraphia also describes this sort of processing disorder. So it involves difficulties with spelling, and it can happen from, you know, sounding out words as well as remembering what those words look like in our head, but also organizing ideas, remembering what those ideas are, being able to organize them and get them down. So here's just a few signs for dysgraphia. It could be a language problem. So maybe they're using words incorrectly, right? I can't think of a word right now, but you know, maybe they're saying, you know, he had the passion, and maybe what they mean to say is package, but they're using a word incorrectly. But it could also involve the poor motor skills. Maybe they have trouble spacing. There's lots of other signs. Maybe their letters are floating off the lines. Maybe they're running out of room, so they can't tell, you know, how big or small do I have to make my letters? And so then you see them cramming down into the margins. So there's lots of different things. Avoiding writing is usually a big one too. So there's a few things that are important to consider for writing. One, of course, is attention. Attention is huge for writing. And oftentimes, if there's a kid with ADHD, we often see these writing difficulties. Another is spatial production. It has nothing to do with what they write, but what their writing looks like. They might have trouble with organization, using the lines, the uneven spacing, the squishing down the margins like I just talked about. They really don't have any clue how to write in the space provided. That's the spatial production piece. Next is sequential production. So that's where we see the letter reversals. Maybe they've got trouble with organizing their ideas. They can't remember their ideas. They can't tie together their thoughts. So it looks like it's just a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo that's just written on the page. Again, this is where I see a lot of sequential production difficulties for kiddos with ADHD. They have lots of troubles here because they'll just ramble on and on and on and on, and there's just no logical flow. That's my ADHD, mixing up letters with sequential production, but logical flow to their writing. Then we get to the working memory piece. That's the counter space. The example that I often give parents is it's like, you know, when you try to carry too much laundry at once, and we're so focused on trying to hold the main part of the laundry, inevitably little things are going to fall off, the socks and the underwear. It's the same thing for the working memory. If they've got difficulties, they can only remember so much information, and it might be just their ideas. So they're trying to rush down because they're just trying to remember their ideas so they don't forget them. But because they only have this much space, they're forgetting capitals and punctuations and spelling, right? Oftentimes what we see is these kids do great on spelling tests. So when they only need to focus on one word at a time, nothing else. But then they can't use those words in a story because there's too many other working memory demands. We also have kiddos who have trouble with word retrieval. So it's like the tip of the tongue. What's that word that I want, right? I want to write, it's that thing. And so they just can't think of the word. Then we see the spelling and the grammar. They lose their train of thought. They can't elaborate or give details. Maybe they forgot what they were supposed to write about in the first place. I see that a lot in my testing. I'll give them a task, and they'll either remember what they're supposed to write about or their ideas, but not both. I see this all the time. Language is obviously really critical for writing. If they have limited vocabulary, you know, they might be overly redundant and there's poor grammar. The executive functions of writing, that's being able to get started. How do I get started? Some kids are just so overwhelmed, they don't even know. once I get started, can I sustain my attention long enough to finish what I'm supposed to do? Can I use my time effectively? Can I notice my mistakes and fix my mistakes? The hardest thing for kiddos with attention difficulty is writing because of these executive skills. All of those pieces are part of it. And then, of course, we've got motor speed. So having to use a pencil in the first place for a lot of kiddos can make writing so complex. Kids can talk way faster than they can write. And so their writing is very, very slow. And if it's too slow, there's no way they can keep up with their brains and their verbal pace. So that's where we want technology to help us. You know, that improves if they can do voice to text, that's going to increase their output speed. It's going to put less pressure on their working memory. They can remember their thoughts and what they're going to write. It really helps with a lot of these pieces. I guess I shouldn't keep touching over here. When we look at differences in writing and in dysgraphia, there's different types. So again, we want to know what exactly is going on with their writing. Right? So graphomotor dysgraphia, that's where the motor execution is a problem. The prefrontal cortex plans the motor response. And so if kids can't plan what they're going to do, they tend to write impulsively, unfortunately. And then they usually write on a tangent that has nothing to do with what they have to write about. I just had a high school girl actually last week who had that problem. Beautiful essay. What she wrote was beautiful, but it had nothing to do with what I asked her to write. So writing needs to be automatic. It has to be extremely automatic. So they don't even have to think about it, because if they're consciously thinking about how do I form a letter, which way does B go, which way does D go, it takes away from their ideas. It takes away from what they want to write about in the first place. We've got our dyslexic dysgraphias. They're just like the reading dyslexias. So we've got the dysphonetic, where kids can't spell by sounding things out. So if they can't read by sound, they probably won't be able to write by sound either. We also have surface dysgraphia. That's where kids can spell phonetically, so they can sound them out, but they can't visualize what that word looks like. So for school, so they'd probably go S-K, food, maybe a U, maybe two O's, and then the L. So they're able to sound it out, but they can't visualize it. And then, of course, the kiddos with mixed dysgraphia, they can't sound it out, they can't visualize the word. They're usually, you know, it's tricky. Sometimes these kiddos are 6 grade levels behind. It's quite severe. And then they're only sticking with the words that they know because, you know, they want to play it safe, but then that's just limiting their writing a little bit further, unfortunately. And then you've got kiddos with executive dysgraphia, and a lot of my kiddos with ADHD have this. Here, they just can't grasp the rules of writing. How do words, how do phrases get combined, right? They have trouble with working memory, remembering their ideas, plus what they need to write about. They're going to miss words, they're going to mix up words, they're going to miss punctuations and capitalizations. So we see this huge discrepancy about what they can say versus what they can actually put on paper. And they have trouble finding words, remembering their ideas, overall productivity. I mean, it's just slow and effortful for them. Finally, we get to math. And so these are common, but they tend to get overlooked. I think we focus so much on reading in school. The research focuses so much on reading. So this is kind of the forgotten learning disability because, you know, it's just not seen. Oftentimes teachers don't really know how to support our kiddos with math difficulties because there's so much out there about reading. So it's important to watch out for difficulties they have, such as remembering even just basic math facts. And so you might see difficulties here with, you know, just calculating and remembering things. I don't know how to get rid of this, but I'm scared to touch anything because I might mess something up. So another term that we use for difficulties in math is dyscalculia. And so that points to the differences in how the brain processes math. That's essentially what these are. Remember, differences in how the brain processes information. So it could be language. Again, we do see language-based math difficulties. It could be finding the words, that working memory, executive functioning, all of those things that I've already talked about. It's not just that math's boring, it's that learning math can be really overwhelming. It can be really confusing and frustrating and even painful for these kiddos. And if they're having a hard time learning those basic math concepts and understanding and processing any math related tasks, that can be really frustrating. And it doesn't help, and I'll be talking about this a little bit later, but it doesn't help when they're hearing messages from other people. Oh, I don't remember how to do any math after grade 3. You're never going to need to know that again. That's just going to add to some of the difficulties. So there's different types of dyscalculia. So the first is verbal dyscalculia. That's essentially math fluency. They're still, using their fingers or having manipulatives to figure things out. It's just not automatic 2 times 3, right? It's usually what we see with verbal dyscalculia. Multiplication and addition are usually the two that are greatly affected, and they can't do those mad minute, math tests. That fluency is really hard. Oftentimes with the verbal dyscalculia, it's language based. So we often see learning disabilities with reading and writing as well. Conceptually, they understand math. They get math. They understand how multiplication works. They just don't have the fluency, right? They just can't get it out of their head. That's where it becomes a problem. Procedural dyscalculia, that's where kids don't really have that procedural understanding. They don't really get the math. They don't understand, skip counting. It's really hard. How do I sequence numbers? They can't remember how to do the steps of equations, right? And when we get to long division or any math with longer operations, they're going to get confused. Where's place value? Where do I borrow? Where do I carry? It's just very confusing for them. Their math facts might be okay because they've memorized the word, the sentence, 3 + 2 = 5, 3 + 2 = 5, but they don't really have an understanding of what that actually means. And especially sequencing the steps as they get into bigger problems. So it's not so much about automaticity because they can remember that sentence, but it's more about the working memory and remembering, oh yeah, when I do long division, okay, now I got to remember to bring down and then subtract. They're just forgetting those little steps. The big thing with procedural dyscalculia is because it's so much about working memory, if there's any anxiety, if there's any self-doubt about their ability to do math, it literally shuts off the math brain. And so oftentimes we see kiddos who get it at home, they're doing great, and then they go and do their math test, and it's because they have no working memory because they were nervous and their math brain is shut off. And we are literally not testing their math abilities anymore. So we really see, they're starting to develop this number sense, but it's not really entrenched. Then we have the semantic subtype, and that's broken down into a couple of different areas. One is the visual spatial. So we might see, trouble with estimation, trouble with aligning those numbers in columns. So they remember where they're supposed to put it, but they just put it in the wrong spot because visually and spatially, they're just mixing things up. They're not able to see pattern recognitions, right? So all of those kinds of things can be really tricky. They're not visualizing. If I say a teacher came into the class with 100 popsicle sticks and, 6 fewer than twice as many popsicle sticks were colored with marker A, blue, as were colored with marker B, red. How many popsicle sticks were colored? I'm already visualizing what that looks like in my head. Kiddos with visual spatial, they're just like, what? Numbers, A, B, they're not visualizing anything. So I think that that's really important. And I know that a lot of kiddos, they do start giving up with math, which we don't want our kids to do because as soon as they give up, they're cutting off their math brain. So we got to keep them engaged. But oftentimes they just really have no clue because they don't have that understanding of math. They can't form that picture of what that means and looks like in their head. Even if you've got a kiddo who's just learning still multiplication, they understand it. They can see, okay, so 3 times 2, I can see 2 groups of 3. They can see that in their head to figure it out. So oftentimes these kiddos just memorize the sentence without actually understanding. And that's kind of where we get into the conceptual thing. They just don't have that number sense. They don't understand what these numbers mean. If I do a number relationship, 9 2 and 7, they don't get that relationship. Well, 7 plus 2 equals 9. 9 minus 2 equals 7. They don't understand that. And then they don't have flexibility. So if I say, okay, kiddo, what's 12 times 7? They don't have the flexibility to be like, well, 7 times 10 is 70 plus 2 more 7. So therefore it must be 84, right? They're just not understanding that, and they don't have that flexibility. So it's a lot of information. There will be handouts. Like I said, for you, you don't need to know the dyscalculia, dysgraphia, blah, 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 blah. You need to know there's different areas. So if you've already had an assessment done, what specifically is it that your kiddo is having troubles with? Because oftentimes, if they just say specific learning disability in reading, what part of reading? If you're going to get an assessment done, these are things that you want to start looking for. But what do? Right? I'm going to give you some strategies. I find that it's easy to get overwhelmed. So if you're finding that you're getting overwhelmed, first and foremost, I want you to know that your job is to instill the love of learning into your kids. So kids who struggle usually hate school and have trouble staying engaged. And so it doesn't matter what strategies you put, it doesn't matter how many thousands of dollars you sink into tutoring. If they don't feel they can do it, you are wasting your time, you are wasting your money. We need to get them engaged and having that belief that I can change my brain. I do have a math brain and I can learn it. So that's your job. First and foremost, it's to get that love for learning in whatever area it is, because otherwise no learning is going to happen, no matter how much tutoring or anything else that you get with them. So your job is really to help them feel confident as a learner and to want to learn, right? Wanting to learn is the secret to your kiddo's success. If you take nothing away from today, know that. Wanting to learn is the secret to their success. It has to be enjoyable. It has to be interesting. It has to be fun. When COVID first hit with my youngest, the online learning was a nightmare, but she saw her doing these kinds of webinars, and she was like, I want to do a thing about, because I'm always talking about screens, I want to do a webinar about what screens do to brain development. And then she was, oh my goodness, she was reading, she was researching, she created a whole PowerPoint. She wasn't writing, but she was typing, she was learning those skills. So she was engaged. Maybe we have to play games, so if you're going to play a board game, maybe instead of rolling a dice, they have to spell a word. And so the bigger the word that they can spell, the more moves they can, go on the game board. So how can you embed learning in just everyday things that you're already doing? I think that that's really important. So I always say we're only limited by our own creativity. So it's about getting creative and getting your kids engaged. I am going to go into specific strategies, but that, if you take nothing else, don't get overwhelmed. Just be a good role model. Bring out books, even if they're Archie comics, to have a time where you're just reading as a family. This is enjoyable. This is things that I want to do. With math, with a little bit older kids, Kate, tax is 5%. You want that pair of jeans? You tell me what the tax is, right? There's ways that we can start embedding learning. So there's a lot of things to think about, but if you do start getting into strategies, if you do start getting into tutoring, it's really important to know exactly what's going on for them so you know how to best support your kiddos. So writing, it's complex. It involves so many different pieces, which I already talked about. So we need to know what part of writing is it? Is it just the motor skill? Because that's super easy. We just give them technology, right? If it's a language skill, we need to work on vocabulary development. There's so many things. If it's, I can't come up with ideas, but once I come up with ideas, no problem. Okay, let's get them brainstorming, right? So we just need to know what it is for going on for them. Now, I am going to go through some general strategies, like I said, but it really is helpful to have a thorough assessment done. If you haven't had one done, you want to make sure that you have someone who specializes in learning and knows all the ins and outs of these things, because I see so many people who do come to me and there's those broad generalizations without understanding really what's going on. So if you have, again, this is not something that I expect parents to know, but this is just an example. If there's a kiddo with underlying cognitive processing difficulties, so maybe fluid reasoning, for example, if there's fluid reasoning, so that's logical reasoning, novel reasoning, things that they couldn't study for, but just sort of on the spot, things like in science, right? We have to make hypotheses and deductions. So They really need to learn how to categorize objects and how they can draw conclusions, therefore, from this information, right? So they need help to externalize their reasoning. They might need pictures, right? They need very specific feedback about what part they did good on and what part they made a mistake with and how exactly they can correct a mistake. Or they need those graphic organizers to visually see, how am I going to organize my ideas, or what are the relationships between concepts. So that's what those kiddos need. But if you've got kiddos with verbal reasoning difficulties, they need a very different approach. Their reading difficulties might look exactly the same from one kiddo to the next, but maybe they need just some priming. They just need some background knowledge. Okay, kiddo, I'm going to give you a story about penguins. Let's talk about what you know about penguins. It's just priming their background knowledge. Very different from kiddos who might have other difficulties. So the more you can understand the nature of your child's learning differences, you're going to help them succeed, because it doesn't matter how good the interventions are or the strategies are or the tutor is unless we know exactly what's going on for them. So let's talk about this. Early intervention is important. Don't wait. If you're worried at all, don't wait, because oopsies, went too far there. Children who can't read well, they cannot learn, especially when we're looking at reading. Any worries about reading, I don't care if they're in preschool or kindergarten, if they can't read well, they cannot learn. Even though they're learning to read in those early years, it's really important that we're intervening as early as possible and as effectively as possible, especially for kiddos who are at risk for dyslexia. That key time frame is preschool to grade 1. And like I said earlier, oftentimes we wait until grade 2 or 3 or even higher, way after there's time. Like by then, there's a lot of skills kids can't even learn anymore. And so we're focusing on other things. So we just don't want to wait. That's going to be important. The younger, the better. Because we do see changes in the brain if we have early intervention that they might not, if they're just at risk, beginner readers, and if they receive that intensive appropriate instruction early on, up to 92% of those kiddos will be able to read by the time they're, older, by in middle school. They can read just as well as other kiddos. So that's why early intervention is. And kiddos who can read well, they usually see 10 million words through the school year. But kiddos with a learning difference in reading, they usually read fewer than 100,000 words in that time. That's like a fraction of words. And that's a huge, just the gap keeps growing and growing. So if you take nothing else away, get them engaged in reading and get help if you're worried. But don't worry if you do have older kids too, because they can still learn, just the way we're going to teach them is a little bit different. So there's things that you can do on a daily basis as a parent, and that's really kind of what I'm going to try to focus on, what you can do. So reading with kids makes a huge difference for helping kids develop into good readers and writers. Reading out loud, letting them go to the library, getting books all the time, lots of repetition. Maybe they're following along with an audiobook. We just want to have a positive attitude about reading and writing. That's really important. Get that love for reading. Reading every day, 20 to ideally even 30 minutes outside of school, makes a massive difference in how many words they're exposed to. And the more they're exposed to words, they're going to be building their vocabulary and their fluency. So that's going to be really important. You want to read a variety of different types of books. So maybe there's fairy tales. My girls, the new Keeper of the Lost Cities is coming out in a few weeks. I'm so excited. It's my favorite series. But maybe they'll like biographies. My oldest one loves true crimes, but she also loves the fairy tales. Maybe it's song lyrics. My younger one, that's her thing, is reading song lyrics. So it doesn't matter, just getting them into reading all types of different things. Even if you've got a really strong verbal child, building vocabulary is still really helpful for them. So maybe you're going to have a word of the day and everyone gets to point, tries to point out where they can use that, and then you're maybe even getting on teams and you're trying to reinforce them using those new words throughout the day. So we want to make sure that we're trying to kind of create that environment for them. It's also critical that they're feeling confident and motivated, right? And I've already kind of talked about that confidence. It's really fragile for a lot of kids, especially with reading difficulties, because they're reading out loud in class often. And so kids can really tell, or even little ones. I remember when my kids were older, or were little, sorry, they would know, oh, Johnny's only on book C. I'm already like on K, right? Kids are jerks sometimes. And so they can really tell reading is really fragile for a lot of our kiddos if they're having difficulties. So we really want to encourage them to read anything. I don't care if they're reading Archie books, that's okay, or graphic novels, that's okay, right? So we just want them feeling successful and that they can do it. That's going to be really important, and showing them how it, fits with life. Children with dyslexia, they can learn to read, but there's just no quick fix. It does take time where we're building on skills and we're kind of building on previous skills. So we want to get some of those foundational things. So we want to make sure that we're helping kids learn skills in ways that they're going to understand, and, also building some of that verbal ability. There's so many programs out there. I'm just going to give you a few examples. A lot of these programs, though, are developed specifically for schools, like Read 180, for example. I put it on there because it's such a great program. And if there's any, school administrators who are going to watch this, it's a great program. It's just super expensive. It's like $30,000, right? So it's fantastic, but not realistic for families to be able to just pick up and buy. But for kids, kindergarten to grade 3, sort of those early elementary, they can learn sounds and those family sounds and how sounds go together. And so that's where we're going to call bottom-up strategies, where they can learn from the sound level to the word level. So we are going to teach them those sounds. That's totally fine. But they kind of have to know those phonics by the time they're 9 or 10, because after that, we can still teach them to read, but we're not reading through phonics because the brain just can't process those sounds the same way. So for older kids, we teach a top-down sort of way. And so we're going to focus more on a balanced literacy program where we're putting more emphasis on morphemes instead of phonemes. Phonemes are the sounds where younger kids can still learn them. Too hard for older kids, we're going to learn morphemes. Morphemes, they're the root of words. So the prefixes and suffixes. So knowing an S, we add that to a word, it's now plural. There's more than one. If we add an ED to a word, so there's those kinds of suffixes, but also it's giving them clues. So the one great example I have, I remember talking with middle school kiddo, and he's like, English is so weird. Why is there a G in sign? It's so weird. It doesn't make sense that there's a G there. But if you understand morphemes, English is actually a beautiful language. It is one of the most well thought out languages because the root word for sign is sig. And that's also already giving us a semantic cue, sig. What are some other words with sig? Signal. And then you could just see it all fall into place for him. He's like, oh, I get it now. I get why that G is there. So we're learning to dissect words into those meaningful units, and that's what a morpheme is. So we're looking at those root words and then the prefixes and suffixes. So then they can decipher those unfamiliar words. Even if they see a G, right, they don't have to say signal, what, where is that? So also focusing on vocabulary and fluency, comprehension, that's all part, when I talk about a balanced reading program, that's kind of what we're doing. And so Wilson Reading System is another great one. So here's some, we definitely want multisensory sort of approaches, especially if you've got a kiddo with mixed dyslexia, for example. Again, these are all school-based programs, but I just want to give you a sense of, the kinds of things that are out there. But we just want to make sure that whatever they're learning, it's systematic, it's sequential, because we're building on skills. And we want to teach listening and talking and reading and writing all together. So they're using all of their senses for reading and writing. And so if we're trying to read words, we're also going to be writing those same words. The more that we can kind of do that together, the helpful it is. I got to pick up my pace here. I've got so many things that I still want to talk about, and I want to leave time for questions. So here's just some more. Again, I'm not going to go into these because a lot of them are more for school, but there's a lot of programs out there. And I'm happy if you guys do have questions, we can kind of talk about those, but the programs really are more for school. I've already talked a little bit about reading comprehension, but we have to, again, make sure they're confident and motivated to read. Assuming they've got good vocabulary, assuming they are interested in what they're reading, most of the time it's all about working memory and those executive skills to read. it's really for kiddos with reading comprehension. You got to make sure it's really reading comprehension problems, though. If they've got problems with foundational skills, it's probably not reading comprehension. But if there are reading comprehension difficulties, it's probably a strategy problem. It's probably that they can read, they just don't have a good strategy. So maybe they don't have a good strategy to help visualize a story or to how to remember that information. So we have to help give them a framework of what information they need to pick up from what they read, how do they organize that information, how do they remember that information. A great thing that you can already do is ask them directional questions. So that is where you're saying, okay, bud, read this story. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. The 3 questions are, who is the main character? Who was his best friend? And why did they get into a fight? So now they're reading with a purpose and they know exactly what information they need to remember. So that's one easy strategy. Here are your questions. Now go read and find it out. Oftentimes kids will get here, you read it, and then you ask your questions, we're going to get a fight. So if they already know what it is they have to look for, that's going to help. Reading out loud, as much as kids maybe don't like it, that actually helps them remember the information a little bit better. Visualizing that text can be really important. Outlining stories before they read them. Here's a story about Romeo and Juliet. Here's kind of the big events, so they can already start understanding what's going to be going on. Being active, highlighting in the text, making notes in the text, post-it notes. The more they can engage with that text, we want that multisensory, even if it's just stopping, summarizing, this is what I remember, Mom, you know, this is what I predict is going to happen. This is summarizing everything that did happen. All of those things can be really important. So there's so many different things that we could be talking about. Looking for clues, using pictures, you know, doing a book walk. So we're going to look at the chapter titles, any pictures that are in there, big words that kind of jump out at us. All of that can be really important. So lots of things to think about, but those are some ideas. Again, there's lots of assistive technology for reading. One of the things that I do look at is even just size. You know, for a lot of the kiddos with dyslexia, if you can have, I hate screens, I really do, but tablets can be really good because they have shorter sentences and you can make the letters bigger. So you want like 14, well, 12 at least, or 14-point font and more spacing between the words. That can make a huge difference. I see kids jump up in their reading quite significantly, especially with reading fluency. If we can just give them bigger letters and more space, that can be really helpful. But yeah, voice to text, you know, audiobooks, all of those kinds of things. It's not going to replace, they still need direct reading instruction, but those things can help. I just want to move a little bit faster here because I'm not even halfway through my slides. Writing, let's look at that. So kiddos with dysgraphia, they have problems producing writing, but their intelligence is normal. So we know it has nothing to do with how smart they are. And I actually see the smarter the kids are, they usually just can't keep up with the written work because, you know, they've got so many ideas and they're on to the next thing and they just can't keep up with the writing, right? Because they're just not able to get out their ideas. It's disjointed. You know, all of those kinds of things can become a problem. So we just want to kind of look at this. So I've already talked about spatial production. So that organization, they're not using their lines, their spacing's all wonky. They're really having no clue about how to use the space. How do I put my words in the space that I'm given? Really easy fix, give them a small pencil. Just a really small pencil so they have better control, better grip, because oftentimes that's part of it. Making sure they're anchoring their paper. I see lots of kids who will just kind of sit there, you know, and it's kind of all over the place. Giving them raised line paper. And if you can't find that, just get glue, white glue, and make a bunch of lines, let it dry so that they can feel the line and it can anchor their letters. You know, there's little things like that. For older kids, technology can be really helpful, really easy. We don't need to, you know, do anything too big with that. For kiddos with sequential production, so remember, they don't know, you know, how to organize their thoughts. There's just no logical flow to their writing. So we can give them some scaffolding activities where we're going to give them maybe lots of different words or sentences out of order. And so now we're teaching them, they don't actually have to physically write, we're giving it to them, we cut up a sentence, and now they have to figure out, how do I build a sentence or a paragraph using those words or using those sentences? So now they're learning explicitly, how do I sequence words and sentences so that my paragraph flows nicely? And so that can help them learn, what's a topic sentence? How do I create a good beginning and a middle and an end? That can be really helpful. So we also want to teach kids how to sequence their ideas using transition words. So this is a lot of the transition words, for example. A lot don't use paragraph breaks. I'll have them, write an essay, but it's all one big long, oh my gosh, even I'm teaching master's students right now, and it's just heartbreaking to see they're writing a 10-page paper and they just don't know how to do paragraph breaks. It's really hard, but they don't know how to separate their thoughts or know how to sequence their ideas or that sort of framework. So teaching them some transition words can be really helpful, first, second, third, even if it's that. However, for older ones, additionally, similarly, in conclusion, most importantly, there's all of those kinds of words that they can use, and they don't have to learn all of them. Just a couple of ones could be helpful that they can just, use. Teaching conclusions is also really important. Again, this is for older kids, but creating that summary statement. And I see, it's very rare that I will see even my grade 12s or sometimes university students writing that concluding sentence. In conclusion, just be very explicit with it. So we're giving them the sort of script to help them figure out how to structure my work and being able to express their ideas. We need to make writing completely automatic for a lot of kiddos, because otherwise they're not going to be able to do any of the things that we've already talked about: planning their ideas, organizing their ideas, adding some depth to their writing and details. So when we know that automaticity is a problem, again, we have to know, why is it a problem? Is it a motor skill? Is it because they don't know how to spell, so that's slowing them down? Or is it just because they can't come up with an idea? Is it because, we don't know. We got to figure out what it is, because there are differences. So if it is a motor skill, just give them technology. There are programs that you can write, like Handwriting Without Tears, but really, we just want their output, because they're using up all of their brain power just for figuring out how to write. Just try to write with your non-dominant hand. Go write an essay with your non-dominant hand, and you'll understand what I mean. It takes up a lot of brain power. So we got to know what our goal is too. If you want them to write a story, and your goal is to get out all of their ideas, I don't care if they're writing it out. Give them technology, scribe their ideas. That's okay. If you want them to practice letter formation, then you're going to give them a handwriting sheet, and that's where you're going to do Handwriting Without Tears, for example. But if there's coordination problems, just skip the motor piece altogether. If they've got really severe coordination, they're clumsy, they never learned how to tie their shoelaces, riding a bike was really hard, I don't care, guys. Give them technology, get them handwriting. That can be really important. For spelling, we want to integrate the phonics if they're young enough, but also remembering what words look like, phonology, and morphemes, and all of those kinds of things. Executive functioning, we're going to be giving them graphic organizers, things like that. With spelling, we want to make spelling automatic as well, because that helps the writing process. Hearing sounds, visualizing what words look like, developing that morphology, all of those are needed for spelling. And so we want to have some key strategies to help them. Spelling does matter. I know a lot of people say it doesn't matter, but it really does. It's very important. And just so you know, if you are working on spelling and writing, that is significantly going to help their reading. And conversely too, if you're supporting their reading, that's going to help their writing. So there's this relationships. We want to make sure we're working on both of those. Is it the most important? I guess you got to pick your battles. Maybe it's not the most important, especially if they're learning to read, for example, but don't give it up completely. If you've got time, definitely start working on it. I found vowel teams, vowel syllables, though these kinds of difficulties are really huge for a lot of my kiddos with reading difficulties. So we want to make sure, what are these vowel teams? It can be really helpful to use grapheme tiles. And actually, I remember working with a kiddo, and I'm like, go get a Scrabble board. She had a Scrabble board. I'm like, bring out the Scrabble, get the tiles that we need, and bam, bam, bam. She could start doing things because she just needed that visual representation. Maybe you're getting them to spell nonsense words, just like or fluke, or you're just giving them made up words to try to spell out. So they're hearing those sounds. So that can be helpful for spelling patterns. A box approach, that's kind of what I have here. So if I've got the word phenomenal, I don't know what I meant to spell here, but now they've got, okay, now, there must be a lowercase, something that goes below the line here. So now they kind of see that visual representation, something with a higher thing that goes above all the other letters, for example. So just that visual cue can really help prompt their memory to figure out how to spell a word, or color coding, just like in the word caution, we're color coding those vowels. So there's a few things like that we could be doing. Now, I talked about the morphemes. We really need to teach kids the structure of English, and morphology is the way to do that. And I actually left a couple of YouTube and Vimeo videos here for you to watch, because even as young as kindergarten, these kiddos can learn these things. So having kids study groups of words, and so these are examples of the prefixes: enjoy, overjoy, able, joyed, joy, enjoying. So looking at these different prefixes and suffixes. So you can do a word matrix like this, and that can really help kids understand why is there a G in sign? Because you would have this sig here, for example. I know it sounds complex, but like I said, even kindergartners can. So there's some videos there that you can kind of see this in action. With executive functioning difficulties, we got to just teach kids that writing is a process. It's not a one-step thing. Oftentimes I'll say, okay, kiddo, write about what you did this weekend, and they'll just start writing. And no, there's 10 steps before you can even start writing your paragraph, right? So first we got to brainstorm our ideas. So this is an example of brainstorming, just everything that I could think about, what I possibly could have done. I ate breakfast, I did my chores, I went to a hockey game, I raked leaves, whatever it is, right? I'm just going to brainstorm everything. Sometimes I'll get kids just to write for 2 minutes. Blah, 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 this sucks, I don't want to write, I would rather be bike riding, I don't care. 2 minutes of writing, that's warming up their brain. So pre-writing activities can be really helpful. Maybe they're brainstorming some words or phrases based on a topic. So just like here, so dinosaurs, some lived in sea and some lived on land. They're all sizes. There's no right or wrong. They're just doing a big brain dump. That's essentially what we do. If we can get kiddos with writing difficulties becoming master list makers, that's the hardest part, is just coming up with ideas. So we can help them, and this is going to help their working memory demands. KWS charts are another pre-writing activity for fact-finding, for research assignments. So kids can divide their paper into 3 columns. What I already know, so maybe we're going to write about penguins. These are all the things that I want to know, or that I already know. What I want to learn, or what I need to learn. And then where do I go for sources? So maybe I can ask mom, maybe I can Google it, maybe there's a book at school that I can read. I remember having to go through my Dewey system and, we didn't have Google, but there's different ways. Where am I going to find that information? Writing wheels can be really helpful, and this book's for younger kids, but you can do it for older ones. We actually have dice at my house where we roll it, and there's 6 different dice, and you have to make a story based on that. So it can just really help with getting those ideas flowing. That can be really helpful. And then again, just understanding it's a process. First, I got to come up with my ideas. Then, so we'll take that example of, Kate, write about what you did for the weekend. Kate, I'm going to generate my ideas. I'm going to do a big brain dump. Then I want you to talk about 3 of those ideas. So you're going to number them 1, 2, and 3. Okay, 1, 2, and 3, right? Now you can plug in, here's a topic sentence or your sentence starter for your first. So the first thing I did was blank, and they can fill that in, then provide details, reviewings at the end, and revisings at the end. They're not worrying about spelling or capitals or punctuation. It's too much. Those are the socks and the underwear that are falling. It's too much for them to remember. So we want to make sure that we're just giving them this process, and then it's a framework. That's oftentimes what kids are missing, is a framework, so that they know every time I go to sit down to write, I'm always first going to brainstorm my ideas, or maybe I'm going to tape record my ideas. words, right? And then I'm going to organize them 1, 2, and 3, and then I'm going to plug them into this thing. That's all they need. Self-monitoring is really, really hard because they're so focused on writing, they can't remember capitals and punctuations. Lay off. It's too overwhelming for them. We will get back to that later. Now, we want them to recheck, even just rechecking, even if we lay off them and we say, okay, go back and review your work, their eyes are going to glaze over. If it's so much work, it's still too many things for them to look at. Capitals and punctuation and spelling, it's just too much. So we're going to have them go through, okay, but I want you to go back through, just check capitals. Super easy. That's only one thing I need to work on, and I can quickly check for capitals. Oh, there's one, because I'm laser focused on one thing. Okay, go back now and look for punctuation. Okay, I'm going to go through. Oh, there's punctuation, fixed it. Or you can, follow this to the organization. Usually I have them read it back out loud. That's a great strategy, because if they're reading out loud, they'll be like, that did not make any sense at all, so that they can fix it. If they're not reading it out loud, their eyes are probably going to glaze over. And then let's go back and spell check. And they might not catch that, but that's kind of the thing. This is for older kids. It's just, I find a lot of kids, they just struggle with the subjectivity of writing. And it's a bit of a guessing game. And I teach university, and it's still, even marking can be really subjective. So, but it's helpful for kids to have an idea of what it is that the teacher is looking for, right? And so rubrics are really helpful. And I find a lot of kids just don't get these rubrics. On a scale of 1 to 4, this is exactly what I'm looking for. So kids know exactly what it is that they need to do. This is getting, definitely for higher ones. If there are retrieval difficulties, so it's that tip of the tongue phenomenon. They're like, I know the word, what's the word? And you can just see them processing, they're trying to think it out. With writing, we got to make sure kids have good vocabulary, because the more they read, reading is really important, the more words they're getting exposed to, and the more words they're getting exposed to, the easier that retrieval piece is going to be really important. We want to make sure that they've got some context. We want to give them some background knowledge and experience. So if they do have to go write an essay about penguins, maybe it's helpful they can watch a little video about penguins, for example, or just talk into a tape recorder about penguins. They can listen to it. That's going to be really helpful. And being prompted, what happened next? Why did that happen? How is he feeling? Those kinds of questions, prompting questions, can be really helpful as well for kiddo. I just thought I'd share a couple of programs. I really do like Inspirations. Again, it's more for school, but I just wanted to throw them out there because things like Inspirations, it helps kids build, mind maps. But we got to figure out what works. Like a mind map like this, it would be way too overwhelming for me. I probably would not have done good with something like this. I'm still a paper and pencil girl to write out my ideas. So we got to find what strategies are going to be helpful for you. But this is just a good way to sort of outline our ideas. So when we look at different accommodations, there are definitely things, reduced workload is going to be really important, making sure they have enough time. I don't like giving extra time, but it's a productive use of time. So maybe we're giving an extra 10 minutes before they come into an essay so that they can organize their ideas, and then they can take a break or brainstorm their ideas. They take a break, they come back, they organize their ideas. So if we're giving them more time, it's for a specific purpose. It's not just for them to sit there being overwhelmed. So I think that that's really important. If they're having problems with writing, they really should never have to write notes. Maybe they're getting another student's notes. Maybe they're getting a study guide. I teach, at university, I'm giving my students the PowerPoints before our lectures so that they've just got them. So I think that that's important. Look at what technology they have. What's a great pencil, even if it's one of those little, IKEA pencils. Is that going to help them? You just got to kind of try out what's going to work for your kiddo, because everything can be, we don't know what works for one kiddo might not work for another. So we just need to think about that. How else can they demonstrate their knowledge? Kids with writing differences, they can't learn writing the same way as other kiddos. So they often need very explicit instruction in how to form their letters. My daughter has writing difficulties, and she starts her C's and E's from the bottom and comes up, and it often looks like a backwards 3. So I have to explicitly teach her that letter formation, because it's rarely taught anymore. So a lot of these kiddos need to go right back to the basics, even just being comfortable on how to hold a pencil and sitting with good posture, right? Because that can really affect, how easy or hard writing is. Math is important because we need to make sure we've got a positive attitude, because remember, as soon as they feel bad about math or anxious about math, we're cutting off their math brain. So I think that that's really important too, that our job is to get kids love learning, in this case, math. We want to show them that math fits in all parts of life. So maybe there's games, there's lots of different things you can do, right? So if they have to take the bus to school, maybe you're pulling out a bus schedule. Actually, I think it's all online now. I used to have to look at the, city bus schedule. Have them learn to read that schedule. Or if they have to drive, you're driving in the car, you guys have to go on a car trip. Maybe it's like, okay, so we're going to drive 100 kilometers an hour and we have to go 200 kilometers. How long is it going to take us to get there? So just showing them math is really a part of everyday life. How long, which grocery line should we go in, bud? Which one's the shortest one? That's kind of that visual spatial estimation things. What time is it now? Google Maps says it's going to take us 23 minutes to get to our appointment. Will we make it in time if our appointment's, at whatever time, or what time should we be leaving? So just having, there's lots of things that they could be doing. Maybe there's a number or letter search. So we're building recognition skills for a lot of our younger kiddos. So you can have a grid of numbers from 1 to 50. And as soon as you see a number, they can circle it on the grid. Oh, 30. I can circle that on there. Oh, that license plate says 21. I can circle that there in the first to a certain number. So there's lots of different ways. Again, it's just being creative. License plates, lots of things you could be doing with license plates. If you scramble things up, having kids make digits, maybe it's digit numbers. You could do it with spelling and letters and things like that, but maybe you could see who can make the biggest number out of that license plate in front of us. So they have to know which place number each number has to go into, right? Or maybe have them all add the numbers together, right? Or find the hundreds, which is in the hundredths place. There's lots of different things you could do. Having them navigate your trips, map it out, watch for speed signs, telling you how many kilometers oh, the speed changed down to 80, Mom, you better slow down, right? Or how many more kilometers, or how many more hours you can go, how much is gas? There's lots of different things that you could be doing. Again, we need to know what's going on. So if there's the spatial parts of math, they need physical representations. So even our older kiddos, don't give up on these. They need those concrete sort of representation of things so they can connect our verbal things. So if we say the word 10, they can visually see what 10 means. If they see the number 10, they can visually see what 10 actually means. And so kids with spatial difficulties 100% need these visual representations. You just need to know if that's what your kiddo is having troubles with. So there's lots of different graphic representations. There's dominoes, there's dice, you can have numbers lines, abacuses, all of these kinds of things can be really helpful to have those visual representations. Graph paper is really helpful for a lot of these kiddos. Making sure that we write problems vertically, not horizontally. I see it all the time where even just my daughter had a full page of vertical, 3 times 2 equals what? That's too hard. It really should be the horizontal graph paper, just so they can line up numbers with carrying and borrowing. That can be really helpful. These kiddos often need lots of different ways to practice. So with verbal, with visuals, lots of different ways as much as they can. I'm probably going to skip over some of this base 10 stuff because, base 10 is fantastic if we can teach it. I think, though, it's just going to be too hard for me to teach it now, and we're running out of time. So I'm probably going to skip over it, but I'll just give you a quick example. So if you've got the problem 17 times 12, there's lots of steps that we have to do the traditional way in which we multiply from right to left, right? So if I do that, 7 times 2 equals 4, I have to carry the 1, 2 times 1. Like there's just so many things that we have to remember to get to the number for 34. And then when we add the 1, then we have to make sure we bring down the 0 because we're going on to the next number, and we're making sure we got to line it up in the tens place, and then we're going to multiply 1 by 7. And there's all of these things. If there's any working memory difficulties, it's going to be really, really easy for kids to mess up somewhere in there, right? And so there's just lots of regrouping, lots of steps. There's just zero room to make any mistakes at all. But if we have base 10, for example, we can get to 170 right away, right? Really easily, because 17 times 10 is 170. And then we have 2 left over. So that's 34. And now we only have to really do 1 math step. So that's kind of where the base 10 is. Singapore Math does teach that as well, and it's all visuals, and I really love it. Takes the base 10, but it also uses pictures or bar models and concepts where kids can really understand math, so they don't have to memorize it. So I'll give parents this question or some sort of variation of this question, and I'll ask parents, okay, here's a pen, here's a paper or pencil, paper and pencil. How would you start this? And oftentimes parents will be like, no idea. Like, just pretend that you knew what you were going to do. What are you going to do? And the first thing they'll be, okay, 1/5. They start writing numbers down. But if we can teach them visually, we don't even have to write any numbers down. There's very little math that actually needs to be done. So if kids have a firm understanding, they don't really need to do much math. Math is super easy. We just break it into parts first. So we know Jenny had lots of stickers. So we just draw a big bar saying this is all of her stickers. I'm not going to try to teach it, but I'm just going to show you. We know she gave 1/5 to her sister. So we'll break it into fifths. 1/5 went to her sister, 2/5 to her best friend. Then she lost 1/4 of the rest at school. So we have 2 boxes left here. So we need to make them into 4. So we cut them all in half, right? We make them all the way across, and we figure out which ones she gave away, which ones she got lost, how many did she have all together. And we can break them into boxes to easily know. And like I said, it looks more complex here, but it's really, really not. We're just running out of time to teach you. But there's really little, very, very little math that actually needs to be done here. And so the only math equation, there's really only one math equation that we need to do to figure it out. It's super easy. Another day, if you have questions, I can walk you through. Maybe I'll do a little video and walk it through. So keys to success for math, because I don't want to overwhelm you. It's really, when we're looking from Singapore Math, what I love about it is we're not sending messages that it's awful or that it's hard. It's easy, it's fast, I got it, I see it, I can do it, and I can learn it. We're making math relevant. I've already talked about it, even just little kids. Let's count how many green cars we see on our way to school, or any of those other ideas that I've already offered. So really understanding that we can talk about math in everyday life, and there's lots of different ways that we can do math as well, right? We can talk out loud about it, we can draw pictures about it, we can physically use manipulatives about it. There's all sorts of ways, and we want kids to figure out what their way is. Are they better thinking about it out loud so they can talk about it? Are they better drawing a picture? Would they rather have those physical manipulatives? It's figuring out what's going to work for them. And it's all about effort. I don't care if they got it right. It's about praising and practicing. If you've got a kiddo who's checked out of math right now, I just want them re-engaged. I don't care if they're getting things right. I want them loving math, right? So there's lots of different things that you could be doing. So games, really with math, again, I hate screens, but there's lots of great math. These are just some examples of some of the math games that they could be playing. And I love math games on the computer because they know right away if they're getting things right or not. So that can be really important. There's lots of different accommodations. Again, this will be something that you're going to be working on with school. So if there's working memory difficulties, just give them a number line. If it's fluency, if they understand math, they just can't do it fast, give them a calculator. Don't make them do mental math, right? There's little things like that. Mnemonics, if they're having troubles with the steps, the sillier the better. I love dead monkeys smell bad, for example. So those are the steps in long division. So they can always remember what's my next step. So I love those kinds of things. Avoiding time tests. So there's lots of different things, but you need to know what their area of difficulty was in the first place. Verbal dyscalculia, like I said, that's kind of the fluency with math, or linking those numbers, the written numbers, with the amount. So knowing this number 10 means this amount of 10, right? So that's where we can look at base 10 counting. We want to make sure their math vocabulary, understanding sums and differences. All of those things can be really helpful. Procedural, we're going to give them manipulatives. We're going to be color coding operations. Oftentimes they're not paying attention to the operation. They think they're adding, but it said subtracting, for example. So we just got to figure out what part of it it's hard for them. Where are they messing up? I think that those things can be really helpful to think about. When we look at semantic dyscalculia, that's really about recognizing basic patterns, right? And so being able to big cat, little cat, big cat, little cat. So they're sorting objects and shapes inside. So we want to have, so I mean, there's that piece of it, but it's just lots of exposure, lots of problem solving, lots of different talking through about their strategies, making a sentence from a verbal sentence. So if I said, well, Sally had 22 stickers and she gave away 5, so that's a verbal sentence. What does that look like in an equation? That's the hardest part. When we look at semantic dyscalculia, the hardest part is coming up with the right equation. You can maybe give them a worksheet of problems, a full math worksheet of problems with the answers there, but half of them are right and half of them are wrong. So they just need to figure out which ones are right and which ones are wrong. They don't have to solve it, right? So those are just some different examples that we could be doing for that. I find that a lot of kids get discouraged. It doesn't matter if it's reading or writing or math, they start to lag behind their peers, and then they believe they can't learn because they're still reading the baby books, or they're using manipulatives in math, or they're still like secretly using their fingers underneath the table. And so they're going to resist as soon as they think they're doing kind of babyish, they're not doing very good, and they're always going to be comparing themselves to other students. Our amygdala in our brain, our emotional brain, it likes us to forget our successes. And so anytime we're making progress as parents or teachers, we can see them making progress, but they will forget it because their brain holds on to that, I'm no good, I can't learn it. So doing something visual like this can be really helpful to show, hey, you are learning this, you are practicing. Look at how many more words you know today, or how many more you got together. Doing something visual can be really helpful like this. It's not just, wow, great job. They're actually seeing that progress, right? So otherwise it's just empty praise. They're not really going to believe it. But if we have something specific, or with the writing, I'll have a kid, okay, I want you to go through this paragraph and I want you to highlight all the words that you do already know, that you could read to me right now. And oftentimes they might be like the, I. There's not very many words, but the more we practice it, guess what? They're going to be highlighting more and more words until soon that entire paragraph is highlighted. That's another way where they can visually see that progress that they're making. It's really easy for a lot of our kids to focus on the difficulties, but if they've got learning differences, there's often a lot of strengths that we miss and that they miss. So for kiddos who do have reading differences like dyslexia, they often have great strengths in reasoning and problem solving and thinking things out. Maybe there's great, like I said, motor skills, or they're great athletes, or great performing arts, or visual arts, or engineering, or science. There's lots of other things. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on that. This was overwhelming. There's a lot. And I think I'll give a few more minutes and then we'll go into the question session, but I'll get to the independence piece. But, teaching those foundational skills is urgent. And if kids aren't getting the help that they need, they're going to have to play a lot of catch up and learn at the same time. And that's going to be really hard if they're playing catch up and learning at the same time. So they're always going to be playing catch up. And so then it's just becoming this big snowball problem, which we don't want to have happen. So, trying then, if you've got this huge gap, trying to close it, it's really effortful. It's really disheartening. So the longer they struggle, the bigger that gap is, the less motivated they're going to be. And when they're not motivated, no learning's happening, so that gap is just widening even more, and they're going to avoid everything, and then that's where all the problems start settling in. So we want to make sure that we intervene as early as we can, right? Oftentimes, kids are showing difficulties with reading, for example, way before they're ever diagnosed. So, you want to make sure there's no medical issues. You always want to get their hearing done and their vision checked just to make sure there's nothing like that going on. But otherwise, figuring out exactly what's going on for your kiddo so that, you can start knowing exactly where it is that you need to go to help them. Start keeping a record. If you are worried, start keeping a record of what you see, right? All the behaviors, the triggers to those behaviors, like, wow, every time we sit down to write, even just mentioning that you have to do some writing, we see behaviors. Write that down because that's going to be really important information. Since we have a bit of time, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to get meta. And getting meta is where we're going to build our kids' independence with school, which is a whole other webinar on its own, to be quite honest. I don't have enough to go through it all. But this is really where we're not telling kids what to do anymore. We're asking them to start thinking about their thinking about their plan, thinking about the strategies and what they know and how they're going to get there. So it's more of a coaching role versus a director role. So instead of jumping in, and I just saw this the other day, sorry if you're watching right now, but I had a mom with a high school daughter who was struggling with her social studies, and her mom's like, okay, so here's this information, and let's look back here, and I can't figure it out. Like, whoa, why can't you? It's not you to figure out, it's your daughter to figure out, right? So we're not jumping in and look back here and because she's never going to figure it out if we're always going to be directing. They need to problem solve themselves. So we are there as a coach. The planning piece is really critical for anything. So what is your plan? What strategy are you going to use to get started? If they say, I don't know, okay, get started, do what you would normally do and pay attention to what you're doing. And that's going to be really important. So these are just some example questions, which are also in your handouts. How long do you think it's going to take? How will you know if you're stuck and this isn't working? What are you going to do? What would be helpful for me to help you? Oftentimes we know, like, just carry it over, just do this thing. We know it, but they'll never figure it out if we're always telling them the answer. So how can I be helpful? That's going to be really important. So when they're starting off, they're not going to know, like I said, those answers. So we just want to be as reflective as we can as they're going through them, just facilitating this discussion, getting their brain flowing, just getting them to start paying attention on different things. So here's some examples of some of the self-reflections your kids can come up with. And you could print these off or have them right there so that they can start thinking, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Even if you have the best system to read or the best system for math, if you're telling them it's going to go in one ear and out the other, they need to come up with it themselves. So we can say, here's a toolbox, but it's up to you to figure out which tool is going to work for you. So here's some strategies. So which one, here's some ideas. If they can't come up here, I've got some here. What do you want? Oh, you know what? I really like highlighting the words I don't know or highlighting the words I do know, right? So those kinds of things can be really helpful. Creating a plan is really important. And this is another framework. A lot of our kiddos with learning differences don't have frameworks. A lot of kiddos with ADHD, that's essentially what ADHD is. They don't have a framework. So we want to give them a framework, like a plan that they could be used for homework, for chores, for going to a dance. I don't know. It can be used in so many different ways. So, here's an example of something that could be used for homework or a chore. You're going to collaborate together. You're going to create it together. You're going to look at all the relevant factors. So when are you going to do it? Where? What's going to get in the way? How are you going to be successful? So having something visual, whether it's written out for older kids, maybe you're going to have pictures for little kids, that can be really helpful. But this helps with supporting them to prioritize, to really plan out and visualize. That's usually the missing piece. They're not visualizing themselves doing the chore. They just want to automatically come home, have a snack, and jump on the Xbox, right? So we're warming up the brain. We're activating the sort of thinking sort of skills that they're having troubles with. So this is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to do my task. I got to unload. My older daughter is great at unloading the dishes before she goes to school. That's the first thing. She comes upstairs, She unloads the dishwasher and then she has breakfast. So for her, it's before school. My other one, it's after snack. I gotta get home. Morning's too rushed. I just want to read my book. I want to get home. I want to read my book, have a snack, and then I'll do it. So I'm gonna do it, Mom, at 4:30. Okay, cool. What are your time robbers? Your time robbers, for my little one, it's her dog. For my older one, it might be her phone, for example, right? And so what are your time robbers? What are you going to do to make sure your time robbers aren't getting, in trouble here? How can you be successful? So really creating those plans. And so you don't have to be the naggy. Did you do your homework? Did you do your chores? Did you They're like, oh, how did your plan go? Where are things with your plan? So they can start thinking. So here's some different questions that you can be asking, just depending on what it is that they might be having specific difficulties with. So if they're forgetting to do their chores or forgetting to do their homework, these are different questions you can get them thinking about so that they can start becoming problem solvers. Getting started on things, that's oftentimes a big one, right? What's getting in the way of getting started? Whether it's homework, whether it's teeth brushing, it really doesn't matter. What's helpful? What's getting in the way, right? What can you say to coach yourself? I really like scaling questions because kids sometimes, maybe it's too hard. Oh, this hard, sorry, I should be down here. Got edited weirdly. So I'll say, okay, so you have to do this writing task. How hard is it? So 10 is like the hardest thing ever. I can't do it. 1's super easy. Like this is kindergarten, Mom. Okay, it was a 9. Okay, cool. 1 makes it a 9 and not a 10. So obviously there's something in here that's not completely hard. What is it that you can already do? And or even if it is a 10, okay, so it's a 10. It's super hard. What can we do to bring it down to a 7 or an 8? So we're not battling, just do it, just do it, just do it. You can do it, you can do it, you can do it. Anything you're doing to try to make them feel better is probably not helping. We don't want to try to reassure them or anything like that. But we're through these questions, they're starting to think, oh, there is something easy in here, right? So those are just different examples of things that you could be doing. Maybe it's a love it, hate it scale. 10 is love it, best thing. I wish I could spend all my time doing it. 1, hate it, never want to do it again. Right? So what makes it a 3 and not a 1, or how can we bring that up to whatever it is? Even just looking at what kind of mindset our kids have, that can give us a lot of information. I do this all the time with my kiddos in my office where I'm going to give them a task. So for example, I might give them a toothpick puzzle, right? Like it's in a shape and then you can only move it twice to make this shape. How are you going to do it? And so then how are you feeling right now? What are you saying to yourself? What's that tricky Loki brain saying? Conspiracy theories like, I can't do it. This is too hard, right? So then we're giving them a challenge and then asking these questions as they go, because that's going to give us a lot of useful information to help them when they're stuck again. So that's going to be really important. So maybe before an activity, during an activity, after, all of this is in your handouts. I really wanted to have this. But these are some guidelines for talking about mindset before, during, and after on a task that can be helpful. Sometimes they just need to get there themselves. I love this. I'll give you a second to read. If we're always nagging and telling them, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it, guess what? We're always going to be nagging them and telling them. And so sometimes we just got to let them get there on their own, where they realize, okay, I got to do something differently here. And I think that that's a huge piece that parents often have trouble with, just letting go. Obviously, if there's, fatalities, for me, if there's blood or broken bones or something like that, I'm going to step in. But otherwise, we kind of need to get there. So I am amazed I got through all of my presentation, but I wanted to leave the extra few minutes that we have to go over any questions. And I've got my wonderful Sally Lee here who's going to help me with questions. She's another psychologist at Core Family Psychology.